All right, Facebook Live, speaking right into the mic. Lynda Fishman, an incredible story, lost two sisters and your mom, 1970, in a plane crash. And we're going to be talking about your incredible story and her book, Repairing Rainbows.
She is what we're going to talk about.
Yes. Okay, so once Fleetwood Mac starts, then
yeah.
Did you tell the two songs? Fleetwood Mac, Don't Stop. That's good. And then the Traveling Wilburys. You've heard this song, but you'll hear the words that we played. So
you can even just like listen.
We're busy, all right. That to-do list takes energy, and sometimes you kind of run out. So Adrienne Gagnon, Quebec's best-selling brand of natural energy products, came up with Energex powder. Just shake it up with water for a little energy nectar with B12, antioxidants, 17 vitamins and minerals in all, and all natural colors and flavors. For a natural energy boost, try Energex powder from Adrienne Gagnon. Always read the label and follow directions.
Should be on soon. Here we go. And welcome back to Life Unrehearsed. I'm Matt Del Vecchio, specializing in free retirement home search and senior transition support, here in studio with my co-host Corey Sirota, clinical social worker and psychotherapist specializing in grief and loss. Corey, we got to run home, tell our teenagers and our kids, stay away from the weed.
That's right.
I don't know how successful we'll be, but we got to...
Well,
After what we just heard,
we gotta talk.
yes, we do have to talk. Open up the lines of communication, even if they're going to do it. Let's open it up. You know, it is Thanksgiving weekend. Any plans or any activities already done?
Funny thing that you're asking me that. Number one, I do have a turkey sitting at home waiting for my whole family to come over. But I spent the day yesterday being like a tourist in my own city. I actually ventured out to the plateau. I asked my friend if I needed my passport. Like
Not bad for a West Islander there, Corey.
Right.
I'm impressed.
I did that, and it's amazing there. Mount Royal, walked around, really cool stores, etc. And then last night was really impressive. I went to the Seagull Center. They have something called Broadway Cafe.
Yes, I heard of it.
You go and I mean, I certainly didn't sing, otherwise nobody would have stayed. But I went and I watched a whole bunch of budding theater people sing one at a time with a fabulous pianist, and just, it was great. It's something I think that once a month at the Seagull Center. Very interesting.
Nice.
Check it out.
Nice. Yeah, on my end is birthday parties. We've got it's just everyone. My son Anthony had his birthday last week. My stepdaughter Axel on the 4th. My dad is on the 9th. So we're kind of doing tonight, a Monday night, a full Thanksgiving and birthday all in one wrapped in. So looking forward to that, Corey.
Very nice.
All right, very interested about our next guest.
Well, we've been anxiously awaiting, because I think I asked Lynda many months ago if she was able to do this, and we're very fortunate that Lynda is in Montreal this weekend, so she's sitting right next to me as we have this interview. So, as you may have already heard, in 1970, when Lynda was 13 years old, her life came to a disastrous halt when both her mother and her two younger sisters were killed in an Air Canada Flight 621 plane crash. At that point, Lynda made a conscious decision to become happy and lead a fulfilled life. She's such an impressive woman. Amongst her many accomplishments, Lynda became a clinical social worker and wrote the book Repairing Rainbows to share her story and to help others who've experienced great loss. Welcome to the show, Lynda.
Thank you.
So great to have you here. So I guess we begin by, if you could share your story.
Well, as you just described, I was 13 years old. It was back in 1970, and my mother and two younger sisters were killed in an Air Canada plane crash that crashed in Toronto. So that left me and my father, who was 44 years old at the time, to somehow figure out how to move forward, having had to endure such profound loss and such a terrible tragedy at a time during the 70s when nobody talked about tragedy, nobody talked about loss. There was no social media available. We didn't know that anybody outside of our circle of family and friends were impacted by this tragedy as well, because we didn't hear from other people. It was just silent.
I cannot possibly imagine. Add to the fact that you're 13, as if that's not tough enough, being 13 in the beginning of your teen years. I'm interested to see how people reacted from, let's start with classmates and then and other family members.
Well, that's such a good question, because it would be so different now, yet there would be certain things that would still remain the same. The one thing that was very evident to me was that people treated me as if I was contagious, as if I had three heads, or as if they came close to me or became friends with me, that somehow they would also be vulnerable. Because this tragedy was so unbelievably terrible, but it could happen to anybody. So people were really terrified of me. The people within my inner circle were really supportive, but supportive in a very different way than they are now. They did everything they could to distract me, keep me busy, so that I wouldn't think about what had happened. Nobody ever mentioned my mother and sisters. Nobody talked to us about how sad and terrified we all were, having gone through something so tragic. So it was really complicated and very different than the way we handle grief now.
You're listening to Life Unrehearsed. That is Lynda Fishman. She's sharing her story about resiliency and resolve after losing her mother and two sisters in a plane crash in 1970. I know for me, my book, Someone Died Now What, I wrote it 27 years later.
And later meaning
after my brother had died. Here, it happened in 1970, and you published a book in 2010. So, 40 years later, what prompted you to write that book, Repairing Rainbows, in 2010?
I wrote Repairing Rainbows over and over again in my head for at least 25 years. But I was never really ready to sit down and do the grief work that you have to do when you write a book about your life and the tragedy that I had buried so deep down, and really never did the grief work that I had to do. So believe me, writing that book and ripping off all those bandages was doing the grief work that I had to do, and never really did it because there were never any opportunities. Like I said, I kept so busy and so distracted and so focused on moving forward because it was much too painful and too difficult to stay in that dark, horrible place. Nowadays, we know how important it is, and we know that it's critical when someone is grieving and has suffered a terrible tragedy. We know that it's really important for them to do that grief work and to get the support and help that they need so they can move forward in a much healthier way than I was able to do. When I did that grief work 40 years later, writing that book, I literally cried for 2 years straight.
It's quite interesting. Corey, we had a guest 2 weeks ago almost talking about the same thing, who had a loss, and it was writing the book that sort of brought out everything, and that was their grieving process. And I guess everyone has their own way. It took you 40 years, but good on you. That's now 8 years ago, I guess, and it's doing very well. I heard over 10,000 copies, so it's obviously resonating with a lot of people. I'd like to just ask you about, you've gone through a whole range of emotions. It's just too much to talk about in terms of emotions. But I think a lot of listeners, Lynda, would love to hear the different set of emotions, and that probably came out during the writing of the book and then pre and post. But first, we're going to hear a little bit more about that. We do have to go to traffic, so we're going to head out to the CJD Traffic Center first, and we're going to talk to Lynda Fishman a little more about this. Good job pointing it, because I was so intrigued with what you're saying, and you saw me.
That totally gets it, and he's like,
see, so we're covering for each other.
I'm on point today. I have to not lie.
It's good. So I didn't do the teaser question that we were scripted to.
We'll get
okay, but we'll ask the question, your range of emotions that you went through. Okay. Is that all right? And then maybe you could ask that teaser question as a
I can ask
question.
that. And what do you really want us to get? What do you want people to hear?
Because we're going to run out of time. So what point? Because we're already out. We've got about 6 minutes.
I really want I think we should really focus on, well, the teaser question, and we'll bring up Camp Barron.
Okay. So you're going to
I
follow
want an
up.
opportunity to bring up Camp Barron.
We'll do that.
So what's the most profound lesson you've learned? Right?
Well, okay, I'm going to ask that. You're going to ask the emotions.
Yeah,
Right,
I'm
you're
going to
gonna
ask
come
the
back with the
emotions as our
emotions, and then
teaser
I'm gonna
question.
ask-
You're going to ask what's the most profound lesson. We might have time for one more question. So if you had to pick just one more question, which
Bring
one?
up something about my kids.
Yeah, I'll ask.
Well, that'll actually be mine, right? Because I'm doing teaser, you're doing most profound,
Yeah.
and then I'll be doing the kids, right?
Well, the question that you had originally
I
sent
said,
was,
what is your parenting has affected your parenting?
Yeah.
I wanted to ask that. Is there another question you can ask?
I'll ask the teaser question then.
Okay.
We'll just
So,
reverse
okay,
it.
okay. So
Okay,
you're going to ask about motions, then I'm going to ask about parenting maybe, and then we'll end with the most profound. Okay?
Yeah, and it
Okay.
actually works out that way.
Yeah,
That's the most
perfect.
profound
Okay,
thing.
okay. Okay, because that's a good, okay, because I want to give a shout out to
So we have about 6 minutes. So your answers don't have to
Yeah.
be quick. You know,
Okay.
you can.
Well, you have your answers are perfect.
Excellent, and you're you're solid too.
Yeah.
well, my speaking that I do, my inspirational
Yeah.
speaking that I do, is generally a 40-minute talk.
Yeah.
And 40 minutes often expands to an hour and a half
Yeah.
because the questions
Yeah.
just keep coming,
Oh, yeah.
and people can identify with loss. It doesn't have to be something so tragic. Loss is loss.
When you give someone the space to talk about it, they will talk about
Absolutely.
it. I certainly, it resonates with me. I used to joke that people stepped away from me when they heard what I do, that I do, whatever, as if it were contagious. But the interesting thing is, whenever, and I've told my husband he can't, he knows it, he actually saw it happen, where the minute I start to say what I do, I'm getting stories.
floodgates
I'm
open,
getting,
yeah.
and he's
Mhm.
like, how do you know?
I'd like to. When we're talking emotions, okay. The question is specifically to you, but I'd like to sort of preface it a little bit because people who are listening, anyone who's experienced loss, and it doesn't necessarily have to be death, probably can go through some of the emotions that you're going to talk about.
Absolutely.
So I'm going to try to open it up a little
Sure.
bit to grab,
Well, because
brought out.
loss is loss. It doesn't
Right.
have to be a
No.
tragedy for
Right.
them to identify. It doesn't even have to be death.
you can't hear the song that we're going to play.
Well, she can hear if she listens that way.
Yeah, if you want to put them on, or if you don't want to put them on, you don't have to.
No,
Yeah,
you just
okay,
listen,
you can
yeah.
do that. Yeah, we'll tell you when it's on. Then you can put them down.
You're so cute. Thank you for the support.
Are you kidding?
Oh, is that the
That's
Camp
a great
Barron?
idea. Yeah.
We're going to get a little plug, right?
We
Yeah.
have to.
Yeah.
John will never speak to me.
no,
No, but
It's
I
true,
want
you
to.
will.
I want to.
I'll be able to.
Huh? Look, he did it. Well, welcome back to Life Unrehearsed. Matt Del Vecchio here with Corey Sirota, and we're talking to Lynda Fishman about her resiliency and resolve after losing her mother and 2 sisters in a plane crash in 1970. Lynda, first of all, thanks for coming in on a Thanksgiving Sunday, telling us about your incredible story and your resiliency. We talked just before the traffic update about some of the emotions that you went through, and I think it's important to know, we were just talking off air, in fact, loss doesn't necessarily even have to be death of someone. There are many types of losses, and I think what you're talking about in terms of the emotions that you've experienced, it will resonate with a lot of people. So can you tell us a little bit more?
Absolutely. I think what happens when anybody experiences any kind of loss, or certainly any kind of death or tragedy, your basic assumptions about safety and trust and security are destroyed, because you now know firsthand that life can change instantly, and that no matter how much you plan for things, everything can change in an instant with a tragedy or a loss. And dreams, loss of a dream is also difficult for people to deal with. So I think people can relate to the emotions, which would be anything from fear and panic and worry and all of the emotions that go along with that. That applies to any kind of a loss.
So absolutely true. I'm at a bit of an advantage to you, Matt, because I happen to know that Lynda is the parent of a 3 beautiful children, one of whom I know personally, Rebecca. Do I give her a shout out? I hope you're listening, Rebecca, who is the director of Camp Erin in Toronto.
Oh, nice, really.
So the question is, Lynda knows I would love for her to speak to what ways her parenting has been affected by this experience.
Well, I think the most important thing for me to focus on when I answer that question is the fact that I was always looking over my shoulder, worrying that something else would happen to me, that another tragedy would hit me and take away my happiness and take away the security and the trust that I'd worked so hard to build. And so I had to really consciously work on making sure that I didn't make my kids into neurotic children. And they may disagree, but I think they're actually really well adjusted. And what they've done is they have used all of those experiences growing up with a mother and also a father who went through a lot of tragedy, because my husband did as well. So they have become very compassionate, empathetic, caring people. And they show all of those values in the work that they do and the volunteer work that they do and the way that they make a difference in the lives of other people. So I'm really proud of the fact that we took tragic childhoods of our own and turned those into life lessons for ourselves and our children to grow and to become really incredible people who help others. They're so empathetic and compassionate, and I'm really proud of them for that.
Well, and that's Lynda Fishman talking to us about leading the way with a lot of your actions, walking the walk, talking the talk as well, after a tragedy of losing 2 sisters and her mother in a plane crash, 1970. All right, so that's 48 years ago. Your book came out 8 years ago, so that was 40 years after the tragedy. You've had a lot of time to adjust, get used to it. You are obviously now influencing, I don't know if that's the correct word, but making an impact on not just your kids and your family, but through your wonderful book, Repairing Rainbows. So through all this experience, Lynda, what would you say the most profound lesson that you've learned along the way?
I would say that the most profound lesson for me has been to cherish and treasure life and to go out there and do whatever you can to make a difference in the lives of other people, because you can use your own life experiences to help other people. And rather than wallowing in any kind of self-pity, which I never did, I chose instead to be very positive, to be very optimistic, to be very forward-thinking, and to take all of that positive energy and try to help other people shift their energy in a more positive direction as well. And one of the things that I'm most proud of is that I have been determined to see Montreal have a children's grief center or any kind of a program that would help children in Montreal who are grieving. And the first step that's been taken by Corey and John Ryder and a lot of incredible people in Montreal has been the creation of Camp Erin Montreal, which just had its 2nd season. And Camp Erin Montreal is going to continue to provide grief counseling for children who are dealing with loss. And like we all know, we can't plan for these things, but let me tell you, the value of having an opportunity to get the grief counseling that children need when they're going through a terrible loss is so incredibly important for them, academically, socially, physically, in every way. And I'm just so proud of the people in Montreal who have worked so hard to make that happen. And I hope that we can continue to see that grow, and that there's actually going to be a center here, which I wish my family could have had when I was a kid, because I wouldn't have had to do the grief work 40 years later. I would have actually been able to do the proper grief work as a teenager. And my father, who suffered so terribly and never had any kind of intervention or help, would have been able to have been helped. And he would have, instead of just existing, he actually might have had a happier life for the remainder of his life.
Well, and that's Lynda Fishman talking to us, and good on you. I think it's fair to say, almost 50 years later, we are making progress. And Corey, you're incredible Camp Erin. I had no idea, Lynda, your daughter was involved with Camp Erin Toronto. Yeah. That's one of the nice ones out there. There are other grieving camps, and I think today's society is becoming a little bit more acceptable. There are more and more organizations that we could turn to. We're not there yet, but
No.
just by having you here on Life Unrehearsed, spreading the word, and so it's wonderful.
We're very privileged to have you. The smile on your face, the energy that you exude is quite something, and thank you for the plug.
Well, you know, just in terms of the news today, just a few hours ago,
Right.
I heard about this horrible tragedy in New York. And those people are not going to have to just, the families are not
Right.
just going to have to fend for themselves. They are going to get all kinds of support and help. We got none of that back in 1970. We were actually left to manage on our own with such a terrible tragedy. And so we have to take all of that knowledge and make sure we do what we need to do for kids here in Montreal.
Thank you so much. You're certainly an advocate and such a supportive person and a pioneer in paving that way. Thank you for coming on today and coming in and coming on. And how do people get a hold of, I'm sure you're going to want to read Repairing Rainbows.
Go to repairingrainbows.com. The book can be ordered that way. It can be ordered on Amazon. And I hope that people will continue to find hope and all of the strong messages that I've delivered in that book to move forward after going through any kind of loss.
Lynda, thank you so much. You're a real inspiration, and your husband's there and with you, supporting you, and we really appreciate you being here with us today.
Thank you.
All right, coming up next week on Life Unrehearsed, join us as we'll be getting some expert legal advice with Jamie Benezri, owner of Legal Logic, and we'll also have Dr. Mark Sherman. He's one of Montreal's leading endocrinologists talking to us about diabetes. So thank you for listening to Life Unrehearsed. You can catch us every Sunday at 4 p.m.
You're having Jamie next week?
Yeah.
Okay, so Jamie's mother, Barbara. You know, in my book I talk about my best friend, Barbara. That's Jamie's mother.
I don't.
Jamie lived at my house one summer. He came to my camp
We have
and
to,
lived at my house. That's so funny.
sorry, that's we have to
Been
talk
on.
to Jamie. But
Smallest
Oh,
He's
world.
been on the show before.
Oh, Jamie.
Oh
Oh my
my
God.
Dynamite. What
He's
a dynamo.
unbelievable.
Okay, we just have to do this. And
yeah,
how
it's
do we-
probably his first time. So he said 1 minute he's on the phone, on the cell phone.
Okay, just need to do this. It's literally a 12-second promo. You're great, great, great.
Amazing.
Yes, it
Oh,
is still
we're still
on.
Facebook, yes. So
Hello.
say goodbye to Facebook.
Bye, Facebook.
Thank you, Lynda. You get to do a little wave.
Bye.
All right. Oh, look, we got a few people watching. Thank you for watching and waving.